worship God together, and get to have some Bible study together. And of course, now just getting to talk briefly about God. And hopefully, we'll be able to see some amazing and truly all inspiring things through God's word together this morning. So, the people that graduated high school this year were in middle school 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember teaching that group in the middle school class in the trailer because we were remodeling the Bible class area. Because I remember Bert being in there, and I remember all of them being in there. But Bert was my buddy that year, and we had a good time. But I remember one of those kids, and I don't call them kids now, but when they were kids, we were studying Genesis. And one of them asked me when we were talking about the genealogy, why did Jesus come through Judah and not through Joseph? Well, I answered with, God does what he wants, and God did what he wanted to do. And I was like, all right, next question. And I moved on, right? But for the past several years, I have continued to think about that question. And even this morning, I still don't have an answer except for the answer that I gave, that God is God and God can choose whom he wants to choose for Jesus to come through. But I think by looking at that question and looking at the lives of Judah and Joseph and their families reveals some interesting applications we can make about God. And I would like to do that with you for the time that I have this morning, is just look at Joseph and Judah's lines and kind of stand back and look at the Old Testament from a big picture perspective and see where Judah excelled, Joseph's family failed, and to see when Joseph succeeded, Judah failed in Genesis. The reason why I think that's such an interesting question, and the reason why we ask that question, well, why didn't the Messiah come through Joseph? Is because Joseph, very much so, is the Jesus of Genesis. He is the Jesus of Genesis, meaning that everything that Jesus did in his ministry, Joseph did in a similar way in Genesis. It was a shadow of Jesus. If we look overview of Joseph's story, it would go kind of like this, is that we would see that Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers in Genesis 37. Genesis 37, he begins to have those dreams that his brothers bow down to him. He tells them about it. They get envious. And that envy leads to them selling him into slavery to the Ishmaelites who take him down to Egypt. So he's betrayed by his own brothers. Who else was betrayed by his own in the Bible story? Well, Jesus was betrayed by his own, wasn't he? Joseph as well was attacked because of envy. Pilate even says at Jesus' death, he says, you are only taking him because of your envy, because of your jealousy. Joseph is treated the same way. Even the thought that he was sold for silver, that silver would be what was betrayed for, that Judah sold Joseph out for silver, in a similar way that Judas sold Jesus out for silver. Joseph as well was punished and sentenced by false witnesses in Genesis 39. Who am I talking about there? That Joseph was sent to prison because of a false witness. I'm talking about Potiphar's wife. That Joseph rejected Potiphar's wife when she wanted him to come and lay with her. And because of her being angry and upset about that, she accused Joseph of raping her, which was not the truth. But Joseph was sentenced to prison for something that he didn't do. As well as the story continues, Joseph comes out of prison. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh makes Joseph the leader of Egypt in charge of the famine. And he sees his brothers again as they come down for food into Egypt, and he eventually reveals himself to be Joseph and forgives his brothers. And there's this great line here in Genesis 50. When the brothers are worried that Joseph's going to kill them for what they did to him when they were little, this is what Joseph says to him in Genesis 50:19. It says, "Do not be afraid, for I am in the place of God. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph making the point here in Genesis 50 that the brothers did something wicked and evil. I mean, they literally tried to murder their brother, but then sold their brother into slavery. They did something terrible to Joseph. But what did God do through those wicked men's plans? Well, he saved not only the Hebrew people from the famine, but also the whole known Gentile world from the famine, because all the nations were coming to Egypt for food to survive that 7-year famine. And Joseph recognizes that. And he says, "You meant it for evil, but God took your evil and he brought something good out of it." Could this not be said the same thing for Jesus? The men that killed Jesus on the cross, they meant evil, didn't they? When Satan entered into Judas's heart to go betray him to have him to be crucified, Satan meant evil, didn't he? But what did God do with all that evil that Friday night? He saved the whole world, right? He brought salvation to all men and women who wanted it through the evil and the wickedness of men's plans. And we see that in Joseph, and we see that even greater fulfilled in Jesus' story. And as you know, Joseph forgave. Joseph brings forgiveness of sins in a way to his brothers. He forgives them of their wrong. And I think Jason's going to be exploring that topic tonight with Joseph. But let's look at Judah now. I think this other story of Joseph we're all very familiar with. If I track Judah's story in Genesis, we're not near as familiar with it. And you would understand why that question would be brought up. Well, Andrew, we just met Joseph. He's awesome. He's wonderful. Look at the great things he does for God. Why didn't Jesus come through him? But instead came through the fallen brother of Genesis. And let's look at Judas's story in a broad way as well, too. We meet Judah when he was born, but we see him first in Genesis 37, 25 through 27. And what happens there is they dig a pit, they throw Joseph in that pit, and they decide they're going to murder him. Reuben convinces them of this because Reuben's hoping to come back and save his brother later on. But then all of a sudden in Genesis 37, Judah sees some Ishmaelites and says, "Hey guys, let's not kill our brother." And he doesn't say, "Let's not kill our brother because that'd be a bad thing to do." He says, "Let's not kill our brother because, we don't need to carry around the guilt of killing our own brother for our whole lives. Let's instead sell him into slavery and we can get rid of him this way." It wasn't a good thing Judah was trying to do. But Judah was the one that suggested not to kill Joseph, but to sell him into slavery. Then we get to Genesis 38. And then as we're telling Joseph's story in Egypt, Moses takes us back to Judah, back into Canaan, and tells us the story in Genesis 38. And all this story is ending with Judah fornicating with his daughter-in-law as she disguises herself as a harlot. And the story kind of goes like this in Genesis 38. Tamar is Judah's son's wife, and he is so wicked and evil that God kills him. So Judah says, "All right, Tamar, you marry my other son, and he'll give you a child." Well, these other sons decide they don't want to give Tamar a child, and so they refuse to give her a child. And so what does God do? God kills him too. And Judah's sitting there in Genesis 38 saying, "God has killed already 2 of my sons because of Tamar." And he says, "So I'm not going to give Tamar to my next third son because I'm scared God's going to kill him too." This is how bad and wicked Judah's family was at this time. Well, Tamar says, "Well, the only way I'm going to be able to get a son is disguise myself as a harlot." And she gets Judah as disguised as a harlot to come and pay for her services. He says, "What do you want me to pay you?" And she says, "I just want your cloak and I want your staff." And he's like, "Well, good deal." And he gives her the cloak and his staff, and he does the deed and he leaves. Next thing you know, Tamar shows back up at home and tells everybody that she's pregnant. And guess what Judah tries to do when she tells everybody she's pregnant? Judah tries to put her to death, not knowing that he was the father. You can see the hypocrisy of Judah here, that he would have just done this, but when finding out his daughter-in-law does it, he tries to put her to death. I mean, how hypocritical can you be here, right? But what Tamar does is she shows him the rod and his cloak, and she says, "These are yours." And him knowing what he does actually confesses his sin to Tamar in Genesis 38:26. Let's go to Genesis 38:26. I just want to read that verse. So I want to show you something here. Obviously, this is a very wicked story, but it ends with this brief glimpse of hope. In 38:26, as Tamar reveals to Judah what he has done, this is verse 26. So Judah acknowledged them and said, "She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son, and he never knew her again." He confessed that he had done wrong. He even said that Tamar was more righteous than he was. But look in verse 38. And so it was when she was giving birth that the one who put out his hand and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. Then it happened as he drew back his hand that his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore, his name was called Perez, and the other one was called Zerah. So what we have here is we have twins that are being born from Judah and Tamar's in an appropriate relationship. And as the older son is being born, all of a sudden Perez breaks through, and they name him Perez because he just shows up unexpectedly. Perez is the one whom Jesus comes through. And I think there might be a message here of the way that he's born. This thought that no matter how wicked things are, no matter how wicked they are created, Jesus is going to come through this family, whether they like it or not. And Perez sort of is that as he comes out unexpectedly, even though he was the youngest child. When this happens, Moses then takes us to Genesis 39. Y'all look at Genesis 39, just at your subtitle. What is Genesis 39 about? Genesis 39 is the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And what Moses does here is he forces his readers to compare Joseph and Judah. We have Joseph who fled fornication and Judah who fell to fornication. And now these two brothers have been forced into a compare and contrast situation. And that happens throughout the New Testament and through the Old Testament. And I'd like to show you that as we go on. When Benjamin is accused from stealing from the disguised Joseph at the end of the book, Joseph says that he will keep Benjamin as a slave for punishment. This is when the brothers come back the second time for food. Joseph sneaks his cup into Benjamin's bag and then turns around and accuses Benjamin of stealing his silver cup. And he says, okay, either I can put you to death, Benjamin, or you can live as my slave. And this is a terrible situation. Benjamin's a lot younger than the other guys, and the brothers believe that if they don't bring Benjamin home, Jacob's going to die because of his grief. He's already lost Joseph. He can't lose Benjamin too. And so lo and behold, we're in this terrible situation. But look who stands up to the plate and solves the problem. It was Judah. Judah offers himself to be punished for Benjamin's crime for the sake of his father. Look at Genesis 44 now with me. Again, we're just going to be reading little snippets. We're looking very broadly here at the big story. Genesis 44, this is the end of Judah's speech to Joseph. He doesn't know he's Joseph. He still thinks he just works for Pharaoh. Verse 30, this is what Judah says to Joseph. Now, therefore, when I come to your servant, my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up with the lad's life, it will happen when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. So your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant, our father, with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became surety that the lad is my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame for my father forever. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father? All we see here is that Judah says, you've got to take me instead. Let me be punished for Benjamin's crime because it's going to kill my father if Benjamin doesn't return home. Now, picture yourself as Joseph for a minute. Joseph has been testing these guys at the end of Genesis to see if they have changed. And then all of a sudden here, as Joseph tries to punish Benjamin for a crime that he really didn't commit, lo and behold, who's the guy that stands up and says, no, Joseph, take me instead, let my brother go free? It's the same man that sold him into slavery so many years ago. What does Joseph see? He sees that Judah has changed. Judah now is willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of his father. This is not the same Judah that sold Joseph into slavery. What happens in the next chapter, chapter 45? Joseph could not restrain himself before those who stood by him, and he cried out, make everyone go out from me. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud. It was Judah's sacrifice here that made Joseph weep and decide to reveal to himself, guys, it's me, it's Joseph. This is a neat story this way. Now, Where's Jesus in Judah's story? It's not here. It's definitely not here, but it is here, isn't it? What did Jesus do for us? He took the punishment for our crimes for the sake of his Father, didn't he? And then all of a sudden, here at the very end of Genesis, Judah is showing the shadows of Jesus. And God ends up choosing Judah to carry out the Messiah. Let's look even into the Old Testament again, very broadly. Let's talk about Joseph's descendants as we go on from the Old Testament. As we look into the Old Testament in Joshua chapter 1 and even starting earlier in Numbers, Joshua begins to lead the people, and Joshua is an Ephraimite, right? Manasseh and Ephraim are Joseph's two sons that received the double blessing of Joseph. So when we read the Old Testament and we see the word Ephraim, that is Joseph's family. When we see Manasseh, that is Joseph's family. And Joshua is a Joseph tribe that comes and he leads the people. And we know the good things that Joshua did. He had the faith to go and take the land. He becomes the leader that the people had never had before. And they really becomes the best leader these people have ever had. And he gives the people their land. He's exalted among the people. Then we go into Joshua 17. And the Ephraimites, Joseph's tribes, are one of the few tribes that actually do what they're told to do in Joshua. If you remember Joshua, Joshua says, all right, guys, we've killed a lot of the people. You go and you go possess the land. There's only two tribes that did what they were supposed to do. And if you look at this map here, and the reason why I have this map, you can see they did what they're supposed to do because these are the two tribes that have the most land. Who here has the most land? Manasseh, Joseph, Ephraim, Joseph, and guess who? Judah. These are the three tribes that did what they were supposed to do, and that's why they have the most land. And there's conversations that they have with Joshua, like in Joshua 17, about that they need more land because they're doing what they're supposed to do, and they're mighty. What happens, though, when Ephraim finally falls off the rails is that in Judges 129, it says that Ephraim and Manasseh failed out to drive out the Canaanites after Joshua died. That they allowed these Canaanites to live in this land in Gezer and in the mountains of Ephraim, as they call it. And because they allowed these Canaanites to live in the land and they did not do what their father Joseph would have done in that situation, the stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Jephthah happen because those Canaanites possess the Israelites. They take them into captivity. Deborah and Gideon and Jephthah's story is about saving the Ephraimites because they did not do what they were supposed to do. Is Joseph's family doing what Joseph's family does here? This is the moment that Joseph's family all of a sudden isn't living up to their legacy. And they're not being who they're supposed to be, and problems are caused because of it. But there's a redeemer in Joseph's story. And this is an Ephraimite that I didn't know was an Ephraimite until I did this lesson. It was Samuel. Samuel is an Ephraimite. He's of Joseph. And Samuel becomes the last leader of Joseph's legacy. He's a leader, as he's a prophet, he's a judge, and he does what God needs him to do for the work of Israel. And this was the greatest leader probably Joseph's family ever had. And as Samuel is here, is doing his work, as we know, that's when the people demand a king. He makes Saul king through God. Then he makes David king through God. And that story continues on. But Samuel is the last moment where we truly see Joseph living up to his name. Then God decided to make Joseph's line king of Israel in the divided kingdom. When Solomon loses his kingdom and Rehoboam begins ruling the Judah area, who does God make the ruler of this area? He picks someone of the tribe of Joseph. Why would God pick someone from the tribe of Joseph? This is where Joseph's family lives. And that's who he picks. And in 1 Kings 11, 25, 27, we learn that Jeroboam is of the tribe of Joseph. But what does Jeroboam do? He breaks the legacy of his ancestors. Was Jeroboam the leader that Samuel was? No. He brought the people into idolatry. Even better, was Jeroboam the leader that his father Joseph was? No, he was not. Jeroboam was the beginning of the end for Joseph's family. And this is where we leave it. It was awful. It was a terrible situation. What even makes it more sad, did Jeroboam not know that Joseph was his father? Did not Jeroboam have Genesis and go, okay, well, I'm of the tribe of Joseph, and this is the legacy that Joseph has left us? Did Jeroboam not know that? I would imagine that he did know that, and yet he still rejected God and his word. And it's a sad situation. Look at Jeremiah 31. When we studied Jeremiah, I told, and I have in the lesson that we did several years ago, or just 2 years ago, that often in Jeremiah, God doesn't call Israel, Israel, or the northern kingdom Israel. He calls them Ephraim. And I said, maybe that's just because Ephraim was one of the major tribes in that area. But Ephraim is the tribe of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. And when you understand that he's talking to Joseph's family, Jeremiah 31 makes so much more sense. Look at verse 19. We'll start in verse 18. This is what God says to Joseph's family, Ephraim. He says, I have surely heard Ephraim bemoaning himself. You have chastised me, and I was chastised like an untrained bull. Restore me, and I will return, for you are the Lord my God. Surely after my turning, I repented. And after I instructed, I struck myself on the thigh. I was ashamed, yes, even humiliated, because I bore my reproach of my youth. That was Ephraim's response to God. Now look at God's response to Joseph. Is Ephraim my dear son? Is he a pleasant child? For though I spoke against him, I earnestly remember him still. Therefore my heart yearns for him. I will surely have mercy on him, says the Lord. Does this verse make more sense if we replace the word Ephraim with Joseph? God says, is Joseph my dear son? Is he a pleasant child? For though I spoke against Joseph, I earnestly remember Joseph still. Therefore my heart yearns for Joseph. I will surely have mercy on him, says the Lord. To me, that clicks. You have here is Joseph's family has completely given up on God. And God's saying, Joseph, return to me. You are my favorite son. You are my dear son. You're my coat of many colors son. And I need you back where you were supposed to be. But instead, you've turned away from me, right? What does God want Jeremiah to do with that message? It's in verse 23. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, they shall again use this speech in the land of Judah and in the cities when I bring back their captivity. He tells Jeremiah, Jeremiah, you get this message I sent to Joseph, and I want you to show it to Judah. Because again, we have the compare and contrast between Joseph and Judah like we did in Genesis 38 and 39. Now, having understand all this history and kind of see the way that these families led, let's put it all together and sum it up. No, let's not sum it up. Let's talk about Judah's descendants. I'm saving that, but as you can tell, I'm ready to get there. We're going to go through Judah's family a little bit more quickly because you probably already know Judah's family. We know the story of Joseph better than we know the story of Judah, but we know the story of Judah's family better than we know the story of Joseph's family. Judah's descendants changed for the better. You remember Caleb. Jason did a sermon several Sunday nights ago about Caleb. And Caleb had the faith to stand against the giants when he was a spy into the land. And even in his 80s, he took the land from the giants to establish the kingdom of Judah. You know about David. David had the faith to stand against the giants of Canaan, didn't he, in 1 Samuel 17? And David becomes the leader of the southern area of Judah and of all of Israel in his time. We know about Solomon. He built God's temple. We know about Hezekiah. He restored God's temple, didn't he? We know about Josiah, who restored God's law. Josiah is someone we talk about a lot, how even at a very young age, he knew what was right. And he is of the family of Judah. We know about Zerubbabel. Or maybe you don't know about Zerubbabel, but you're going to know about him now. Zerubbabel was the main leader, the first governor, who returned back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple when they were allowed to return and rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel was the first governor. Nehemiah is going to take his place later. And at the end of Haggai, God goes to Zerubbabel and he tells Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel, I'm going to give you my signet ring and your descendants will reign here forever. And what was God talking about? He was talking to Zerubbabel about Jesus, who Zerubbabel will be a father, an ancestor of Jesus. And who's the last person of Judah that we know about that was the leader for his people? It was Jesus, right? And what did Jesus do? Jesus, like those in Judah of his family, offered himself to be punished for our crimes for the sake of his Father. You can see how these people drew strength from each other. Yeah, the family was doing what the Judah family does. They were saving. They were being the heroes of the Old Testament. And as Joseph's descendants get worse, Judah's descendants get better. And the family switched. Now, let's sum it all up. This is Joseph's line. You remember Joseph was sold out? Joseph turned around and he saved his brothers, right? We know about Joshua delivering the kingdom of Israel. We know about Ephraim failing in Judges to cast out the Canaanites. We meet Samuel, our new leader. We know about Jeroboam and how he failed. And Joseph's descendants just got gone and forgotten. But we also know Judah's timeline, don't we? We know about how Judah sold his brother Joseph out. We know about Judah visiting a harlot. We know about Judah sacrifices himself to save Benjamin. We know about Caleb fighting the giants. We know about David fighting the giants. We know about Solomon building the temple, Hezekiah restoring the temple, Josiah restoring the law, and Zerubbabel rebuilding the temple. And then, of course, we know about Jesus, hopefully. There's some observations I want to make about this timeline. Now that we have it all up here together, look at Genesis 49 with me. And I'm going to make some 3 comments. The first comment I want to make, especially looking at this timeline as you're turning to Genesis 49, these 2 houses come together in a lot of special places. The first place was when Judah and Joseph were brought together in Genesis 38 and 39 to show that compare and contrast. But as well, who was Joshua's right-hand man that goes and does the work with him? Well, it's Judah's descendant, Caleb, right? Who does Samuel mentor and teach how to rule Israel? Well, it's Judah's descendant, David, right? When Solomon fails, who takes over? It's Jeroboam. And these brothers are brought together often. And I think they're supposed to be brought together often for our sakes. That we can do that compare and contrast and see when one succeeds, the other one fails. Or sometimes they both succeed, or sometimes they both fail. Number 2, do you think these people pulled encouragement from their fathers? If us that had good grandfathers, good great-grandfathers, or whatever it may be, do you pull strength and encouragement when you hear stories of what your forefathers did? I do. I like to hear stories about things that my granddad and my grandmoms did. And when they did good things, I get encouraged by that. Do you think Josiah knew about David and Caleb? You can picture for a moment when Josiah finds the book of the law, and he has the book of the law read to him for the first time. And the guy comes there with Genesis, and he starts reading Josiah Genesis for the first time. And he says, and then Judah. And Josiah goes, that's my ancestor. I'm of Judah. What did Judah do? Judah sold his brother Joseph for silver. Oh, no. See, Josiah could have been disappointed by that. Would things have gotten better as he read Joshua and learned about Caleb? Josiah goes, wait, hold on, Caleb's my ancestor too. What about when Josiah was beginning to do all of his reforms and trying to restore the temple and the law? Would he not have looked to David and Solomon and Hezekiah for encouragement about these things? I think he would have. And I think these men left a powerful legacy for the other men and women under them to follow. The word legacy, you can't define it the way we're using it. The word legacy simply means passing down money. But I'm using the word legacy, and I think sometimes we do use the word legacy this way, when we talk about passing down principles and attitudes in faith. That these things can be taught and they can be passed down to other generations. This family did not pass it down, this family did. How did David have the encouragement to fight the giant? Did he not know that his forefather Caleb did the same things? He did know his forefather Caleb did the same things. And I think we can be encouraged by this being our legacy as well. after now looking at that, here's my third point, and that's Genesis 49. Look at the blessings that are given to the sons. This is Jacob giving his prophetic blessings to the sons. This is what he tells to Joseph in verse 22. He says, Joseph is a fruitful bow by a well. His branches run over by the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. But his bow remained strength, and the arms of his hands remained strong. What is Jacob talking about? Jacob's talking about this situation. Joseph being sold out, but instead overcoming. Look at verse 25. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you, with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breast of the womb, the blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors. Up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills, they shall be on the head of Joseph, and the crown of the head of him who is separate from his brothers. He tells Joseph, your family from here on out will be separated from your brothers in a good way. And how did that happen? Well, I would suggest to you that there were two men that really made that true. And it was Joshua and it was, where is he? Samuel. That those two men did live up to the legacy that Joseph left for him. They did live up to this blessing, didn't they? But the blessing wasn't forever. It wasn't into eternity. Now look at Judah's blessing that Jacob gives him. Judah's blessings in verse 8. Jacob says, Judah, you are he who your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down. He lies down as a lion. And as a lion, who shall rise him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the people. Who fulfilled that for the Judah's family? I mean, you could make an argument that David did. You could make an argument that Solomon did. You could even make an argument that Zerubbabel did that. But who truly fulfilled that blessing for Judah's family? It was Jesus. That's why we call him the Lion of Judah. It comes from this passage right here. That he is the lawgiver and the leader of obedience for his people. And God chooses Judah to bestow on this blessing. This is what I want us to take home from this. Because that's a lot of information. And the point of this isn't just to have a historical knowledge of the things that happened in the Old Testament. There's a reason why God told us these stories. And I think we can pull some reasons out before we leave this sermon. One is God's plans can work through the sinful as much as they can work through the good, can't they? Did God work good things through the sinful things done to Joseph? Yes. Could God work through a sinful man like Judah who fornicated with his daughter-in-law to bring about the Messiah? Yes. And frankly, we see here that it doesn't matter if you're good or you're evil or what you did in the past. God can work his spiritual plans through you if he so desires. He can accomplish things, can't he? Now, of course, from a salvation perspective, there's a need for us to be on board with that, to accept that from a salvation perspective. But when God has plans in general and things he just decides he needs to accomplish, he can work through evil men or good men. Nothing can stop God. And I get that, especially from Judah's story. Here's my second one. All it takes is one person to change a family's legacy. All it takes is one link in the chain to stop something good or to stop something evil. A family tradition or a family practice that's good or evil. Whether it's evil to good, like Judah's family. Evidently, Caleb was a link in the chain that stopped the evil practices of Judah and went on to something good. Or like Joseph, that someone like Jeroboam was the broken link in the chain that ended the good things of Joseph and set the course for evil for the family. All it takes is one. My granddaddy hated alcohol. Hated it. Despised it. And it's because of the things it did to him and his family when he was young. And that legacy has been passed down. And I used to be told by him about how terrible alcohol is. Whose decision is it whether that continues to be passed down in my family or not? It's my decision. I can choose to pass it on. I can choose not to pass it on. To say as well, there's also a tradition in my family of being part of a denomination, very influential in denominational churches. Whose decision is it whether that gets passed on or not? It's my decision. Whether to decide which legacy is going to pass through or what's not going to pass through. And you see that with these two families. That's a burden. And it's something I think we need to be very considerate about. We will influence the next generation, whether we want to or not. We will pass on something to the next generation, whether good or evil. And we have to be mindful of what we're passing down. Is our family going to be like Joseph's that started off great and just went to ruin? Or is our family going to be like Judah that did not have good beginnings but went on to something greater? Now, to give a big clarification about this, when we're going to be judged on our own feet. We will not be judged by our ancestors or our descendants. And that's because we can only control what's happening right here. We can't control the future. We certainly can't control the past. So we're going to be judged on our own. But we can decide what kind of influences we're going to leave for the rest of our family from here on out. And it's something to be mindful of. I think we see that in Joseph and Judah. Here's another application. God will surprise you. He does not always do what we think he should do. And that's why that question got brought up in that middle school class. Why did God choose Judah's family and not Joseph's? Because for all intents and purposes, when we're reading Genesis, and if we were God, we were like, all right, Joseph, come on, let's bring on the Messiah. But evidently God said, no, I'm going to choose this guy, the guy who sold his brother out. God will surprise you. We cannot guess how he will choose or react unless he tells us. We don't know him like that. Maybe you've heard of this scenario or this context before. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The more you're aware of what you don't know about that subject. And that's why you have people that are very ignorant that speak very loudly about certain topics. The very reason why they're so bold about their beliefs about their topics, because they're ignorant, is because they are not aware of how much they don't know. But when you meet people that are experts in a certain subject, they talk very little. And the reason why they talk very little is because they are more aware of all the things that they do not know. The more you learn about a subject, the more you're aware of the things you do not know about the subject. And I would say that that works with God. As Christians, the people who think they have God figured all out, the people who say things like, well, I know this passage says this, but I don't think my God could do that. I know the passage says this, but I just don't believe that God would do anything like that. Those people who think that they can choose and guess for God, they have no idea who God is. They're ignorant of God. And that's why they're so bold to speak where the Bible doesn't speak. They think they got God all figured out. But the Christians who know God, they know that they do not have God figured all out. The more you will learn about God, and the more we talk and read about things like this, the more you are aware of all the things about God that you do not know. And the more I learn about God, and the more I'm aware of the things I do not understand about God, the more I fear God. Because I do not have him all figured out. And again, he still surprises me. And he still shocks me. And I think, God, why did you do that? I don't know who he is. All I know is the things that he's given me. And I know that I'm going to spend my entire life on this earth, Lord willing, trying to figure him out just a little bit more. And that's what creates the awe and the fear that we have for him. To be able to humbly admit we do not have him all figured out. And we only are going to work on what he gave us. Right? And I think you can get that out of this Judah and Joseph story. I also think that there will always be a time and a place for Christians to cover Old Testament stories. What's the purpose of the Old Testament? It's to teach us about who God is. It's to be that tutor so that we can come to Christ. How are you going to fear Christ in this grand plan if you don't even know who God is? No, you got to know who God is. You got to know him well enough to know that we do not have him figured all out. And we should be fear of him and in awe. Thank you for your close attention. Remind me for the invitation song, I have the clicker. I have to click through the songs. So if the songs don't work, somebody yell at me. You can go ahead and put out your Bibles. As a way of invitation, if you truly fear God and you want to be his, we'd like to assist you with that. We would. Thank you again for your attention to this sermon. I told Jason that there's only probably going to be 4 people that are going to really like this sermon. It's going to be me, Jason, Pat, Al, Pridmore. But I think there's more people in here that would appreciate a message like this. When you're able to see the broad picture like this, you can realize what all great lengths God did to bring the Messiah to the earth. What was the purpose of bringing the Messiah to the earth? What was the purpose in doing all these things? Well, can I tell you that the purpose of doing all these things was so that God would have the opportunity to save you? And he was willing to put all these people through all this just for the opportunity to save you. If you're willing to willfully accept that, please let us assist you if you come forward as we stand and sing.